Hey everyone, this is Chris Miller and you're listening to the EduMind podcast. If you're an architect, project manager, or a nurse, or maybe you're just curious about these career paths, then our podcast is one that you're not going to want to miss. Each week, we'll be talking to subject matter experts, course instructors, and other special guests to bring you the latest and greatest in architecture, project management, and nursing, and a whole lot more. Now, let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of EduMind's weekly podcast. I'm Chris Miller, and today I got a Mr. David Fouche with us, a special guest. So let's welcome him aboard. And David, thanks for joining me here this morning. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. I was raised overseas. My dad was a State Department official. I wanted to be an architect when I was about 5, 6 years old. I was building little houses with matchsticks and cardboard paper, little model houses. So I was modeling from that age, I guess. I went to the University of Virginia. I studied architecture, got my license in Washington, D.C. This was back when we took the exam by hand. It was all hand done, and you had to go to a big. We went to Catholic University and sat in this big hall with all these people. It was kind of fun. 4 days, 10 hours a day, and then you were done. And then I helped transition our firm from hand drafting to CAD. We got the first computers in CAD stations and helped them with data CAD. Later moved to MicroStation. We did some BIM, did a lot of BIM work throughout my career. Always had an interest in software development and automation of things. So I was a CAD manager, BIM manager, and then eventually I worked for a couple of commercial software companies, and it's been a great ride. So that's a little bit about my background.
Well, I appreciate it. Sounds like it's been a good ride, man. You've been modeling since a pretty young age there.
Yeah.
Very nice. It's nice when you kind of know early on what you want to do. Not everyone, has that, I guess, luxury, or knows that, I guess, not even luxury, but has that in them, which is great. Sometimes people find out much later in life, which is okay. But that's pretty cool that you've had this passion for, since you were a little kid. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Today, we got a pretty interesting topic. We are talking about carrying through codes, building and life safety codes. That sounds pretty exciting to me. Let's start off with, when people think of codes, they're good, they're bad. You love them, you hate them, but you need them, right? Definitely need them for the safety of others. So, what do building and safety codes encompass?
Well, it's a lot of things. And I suspect a lot of people know a fair amount about codes. Some people know more than others. And I spent a lot of time in my career dealing with codes up in Philadelphia. We did the new business school the new Alter Hall Business School for Temple University. We teamed with Michael Graves, did a lot of code work on that one. We did a lot of code work for the Department of Energy and some of the big facilities they have around the country. And at first you think that codes are, I got to deal with codes. I got to read this big old book. I got to, it's like being a lawyer. I didn't go to law school. I could probably make more money there. I don't know. And so nobody wants to deal with codes. But the fact is, as architects, we are trained and we are licensed to protect the health, safety, and welfare of people. And that's what codes do. And I think we sometimes forget about that. Even I do. When you're in the minutia of whether the door handle needs to go this way, or it needs to be kind of a lever, or you can actually use a handle, whether it's at this height or that height. Is it 2 inches tall? Does it project into the space too much? You just feel like you're overwhelmed. But all of these rules were written in blood. Sometimes literal blood, sometimes not. Every panic device on every building everywhere is there for a reason, because people got trapped and they couldn't get out of a building and there was a big fire. So when you start thinking about codes as, I'm a little bit on a soapbox, I realize, but when you start thinking about codes as I'm really protecting people, people are going to live thanks to the work I'm doing, literally. It just kind of changes your perspective on it. I'm here to help people, to save people. My son's in kindergarten and I'm a substitute teacher there. And when they have a fire drill, or they have rules in the halls for walking a certain way or being quiet, all the kids are like, wow, all these rules, but it's the same thing. They're there to protect the kids. You're always there to protect the people inside that building. And so codes, that's what they're meant for. So you have some codes that have to do with building codes to make sure the building doesn't fall down, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That the structural steel, actually supports the roof and what have you. There are other codes that guide egress, for example, how you get out of a building in case of an emergency. And there's different types of emergencies, not always fire. There are codes that say if there is a fire, it isolates people, or isolates the fire, I should say, so that people can get out safely and can get to a safe place. These codes work. They've been proven and tested over time. And it's, so there's different types of codes depending on what it is you're dealing with, and what what the hazard is and what the dangers are.
No, that's a great, background and kind of a summary of it. And, you're absolutely right. Like, I remember when I was in school as a kid, I went to school in California. So we had fire drills and we also had earthquake drills.
Right.
And, I remember when we were kids, you kind of got excited when you knew that fire drill was on this given day, because it got you out of class for a few days. You don't really take it as serious because you don't know. But you're absolutely right. I mean, they're done for a reason. They're in place for a reason. And it's good to know that there's people out there like you that are ensuring that these codes are being met. In that way, you are keeping the people safe.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. California has its own codes, specific codes. Some of them you might consider them political, for inclusion or whatever, but a lot of them do have to do with earthquake design and so forth. Florida has codes that are very much geared towards hurricanes and that kind of lateral loads and so forth. And every state within really every jurisdiction within the entire country adopts codes, and they sometimes amend those codes or add to them. But every locality, I live in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and this municipality has to adopt certain codes and say, we are going to use this code. So what's interesting to me about that is that it's not like the IBC or NFPA has said, thou shalt. The local community has decided we will adopt this code. We have decided that this code works for us in our situation for these reasons. And then we're going to tack on these amendments or these additions or these changes or whatever it is that they have to do. So it's important to remember that it is at the local level that you're solving these problems.
That's interesting. I never thought of that. I mean, I thought, hey, some big governing body was like, hey, these are the codes you're going to have to follow, and that was it. But that's interesting that it's even on a local municipality level that these codes are, I guess, decided upon.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story. I was working for the Department of Energy on a building once, and it was a fairly large building, and a lot of people were involved. And we said, okay, we've got some issues here. We got to figure these out. Who is the authority having jurisdiction? That's the AHJ. That's the building official, whatever you want to call it. Somebody has to make a call here as to, first of all, what this particular code means, and second of all, we can't do that. Can we do something else? And we could talk about that too. So you go to the AHJ to get a ruling. Well, they couldn't tell us who the AHJ was. It's a Department of Energy site. They had a contractor involved. They also had the local NNSA people involved, but you also had headquarters up in Washington, D.C. And they said, we're not really sure who's allowed to make the call here. They didn't say it in those terms, but that's what it boiled down to. So we actually had to write, you might call it a determination, which is a type of code that says this person is the AHJ. This person is the authority having jurisdiction. So it's kind of interesting. Even there, we had to figure out, what to do and who could make the call. So
that's interesting. David, you were talking earlier, and something caught my ear, and I was going to bring it up earlier, and I just didn't find the right time. So you mentioned something about door handles, whether or not it could be a round knob or a lever. So there's actually a method or a reasoning for.
Yeah. So this is interesting. And I worked for Allegion, a great door hardware company, for a while. And in their digital group, we were building some tools there. And I learned a lot about codes surrounding doors. There's actually a lot, because if you think about it, if you've got to get out of the building, how are you going to get out? You're going to walk out the window? Are you going to be a ghost and walk through the wall? You got to use a door. And the door, if there's a fire inside that room, you want that door to close.
Right.
So that, and if there's pressure, like if, for example, in my office here, when the air starts blowing, it's going to blow the door open, because there's pressure on that door. So the door closer has to actually be able to close the door under certain pressure. All of these things factor in. So door handles, I don't know if you can see my door back here, but it's a regular doorknob like you'd have in any residence, and that's acceptable. But imagine somebody with disabilities, an older person, a person with arthritis, they can't turn that knob very easily.
That's true.
Right? So a lot of there's codes that say you have to have a lever design, which means you can easily grab the door handle and turn it like this. That's something that somebody with arthritis or who has weak bones or weak muscles could actually turn the door handle. But take it a step further. Now you got a fireman busting through this school or whatever it is, or this it could be a home for elderly people who are having who have disabilities or whatever. He's busting through trying to get to the fire, and his hack catches on that door handle, and now he's so the door handle not only has to be a lever, but the lever has to turn back towards the door itself. There's a tiny little gap that's allowed. I mean, all of this is written in the codes.
That's crazy. Makes sense, right? When you explain it. So let me ask you this. You say some doors have to have like the lever. So does the lever always have to go down, or can they also be?
It typically, yes. But you could have a situation where you would say, and I want to be very clear here. I am not a code expert. They change constantly. So they may have changed, and somebody out there may say, "No, you're wrong, David." That's true. I'll own up to it. Typically, yes, they have to go down. But you can make an argument if you needed to make an argument for it going up for a specific reason for a given resident, nursing home or something. You could go to the AHJ and say, hey, we got a situation here where this door handle needs to go up instead of down. And you make your argument and they can rule and say, all right, it's just like going to a judge. It literally is like going to a judge, making your case, and they give you and they can grant you the authority to do that. Really on any code, pretty much any code that exists.
That's interesting. The reason why I asked about the door lever is, so in our office building, we assume all door levers go down.
Right.
There's a couple of office doors where I try to open, like I'm pushing down on the lever, and you have to go the other way. So I'm like, that doesn't make sense. So I don't think they did that on purpose. I just think the door doesn't work.
Well, that brings up a good point. That could have been poorly installed. And so if you think about a lever that has to open this way. Mm-hmm. Well, but now they flip the door, and so the lever is going to be on the opposite side. The installer might just take that, turn it around, and install it this way, not realizing that lever can no longer go down because it was meant to go this way, right? So if you can see my hand, all of a sudden it doesn't work, and that may be a poor installation. But that brings up a good point. You have a building inspector who can go into a building and say, hey, this isn't working properly. This doesn't meet code. And he or she can do anything from fine you to say, hey, you got 30 days to fix it, to shut the entire building down and say, you got to get everybody out of here. Nobody's allowed to be in this building until you fix this. They have the authority to do that, the building code official.
Cow. We've been in our office building probably, I'm thinking going on 7 years. And I can promise you at least twice a week, I run into those same two doors trying to open the office, that door, pushing down, and I run right into the door because you had to lift it up. So that's interesting. But man, those building inspectors, they got some power.
They do, but it's for a reason. What if you? And here's a good point, Chris. What if you were trying to get out of a building, and you had to go through that door? I don't know what door you're talking about, but imagine you're trying to you're getting out of the office, and you can't get out, and you're in a panic, and and you're trying to open that door. Your mind is not going to think straight. Right. You're not going to remember it has to go up. So you're suddenly locked inside this room, and you can't get out, and you panic. And every second counts. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Every second counts. Not just because the fire spreads, but because worse, and people forget this, it's that smoke. The smoke will fill up faster than you imagine. That's what kills people. People don't really burn to death. I mean, they do, but what really kills people or severely injures them is the smoke. So that smoke is spreading, mm-hmm. and all of a sudden you can't, even if you could open the door, it's too late. That smoke blows in through the door. You're confident, you can't find your way out, you can't breathe. That lever could make a huge difference. It could save somebody's life. I would urge you, Chris, to go tell whoever owns your building to fix those handles.
I'm going to, because like I
said, as we finish this,
I'm tired of running into the same door over and over again.
Yeah.
That's interesting though, because you make complete sense. So we're talking about codes, and we're kind of having some fun with it, but it's a very serious thing, right? I mean, again, they're there to save people's lives, make sure structures stay upright, and things like that. So,
let me tell you, this is one that's been near and dear to my heart. I have 6 kids. They've all, and 4 of them are still in school. One is in college and one is past. But there's been a lot of talk over the last 3, 4, 5 years about school shootings.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of school districts and parents have wanted to chain those doors closed, and they've come up with all kinds of ways to keep those doors locked so a shooter couldn't get in. And they want to protect their kids, and I get that. And our school district's no different. They've wanted to do this, and because what they're trying to solve a real life-threatening problem. Totally get that. So the problem is, if you close that door, if you lock it shut, and there's a fire, nobody can get out. People can't get out through that door. The counter argument that we hear is, oh, well, nobody's died from a school fire in 50 years. You know why?
Yeah.
Because of the codes. Because these buildings are sprinklered, because they have proper egress. That doesn't mean there hasn't been a fire in a school. It just means that the building has protected these children from that fire, and they were able to get out quickly. And it not only saves the kids' lives, it also saves the firefighters' lives, the administrators. The principal's going to stay in there until the ship goes down, right? So it's saving his or her life too. People forget that. And there's ways to solve these problems, probably beyond this podcast, but there's ways to solve that very problem they're trying to solve without totally locking that door down. But they're very serious, and they can have very serious consequences.
No, you're absolutely right. I remember, years ago when I lived in Albuquerque, they had some of these Walmart supercenters. They were open 24 hours, and
right.
Some of them closed at like 11 p.m. And they had a night crew that came in and, did the restocking of the shelves and all that stuff. Well, they would lock the door, so you couldn't get in or get out. But they didn't last very long. They had to start letting the doors open on their own, because if there was a fire, and only, the manager is the only person that can unlock that door, he's way in the back of the store. Right. So much precious time is lost. So it's these small things that we don't think about. Like, sometimes, and it's not just about with codes, but it's like a lot of things is sometimes, you're trying to solve a problem and you think that, okay, this is the solution. But you don't take a look at it from maybe other avenues and see what other issues pop up.
I tell you what, let's take that Walmart example. It's a great example, because let's say the fire broke out near the front door.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen supermarkets where after certain hours, when the occupancy went down and there were fewer people, they've got 2 doors. Our Kroger does that. Mm-hmm. And they might lock one of them at night. And you could, so you can use the other one, but the other one's locked and you have to come in and out of this entrance. You can do that. But you still have to have a second exit out of that building. And a lot of people forget that. The reason is, what if the fire breaks out near the door? Then what do you do? So you've got to have 2 operable doors on opposite ends of the building. And there's very strict laws or codes that drive all of that, so that if the fire were near the front door, there's a back door you can get out of. And that's kind of important to remember too, that's even in an office building. Imagine, Chris, right now there's a fire, you're trying to get out, and then you suddenly find the fire is out your normal way of getting out. What do you do then? You've got to have that second exit to get out.
You're absolutely right. And here's something I'll throw out your direction is, you bring up a good point, right? I mean, if the fire's in the front, there's got to be another exit. So, as kids going back to school, elementary school, maybe middle school, they probably still did this. They did the fire drills, right? Mm-hmm. And we, as kids, we thought they were just fun, good way to break up the day, get out there. Right. But here, you brought up a good point. Here I am sitting in this office doing this podcast with you. Right. And if a fire happens, I have no clue what I'm going to do. So I think it's something that should be practiced even when you're an adult, making sure that you got a fire exit plan posted, and that how to use it and where to meet up with the rest of your associates when you get out. So you brought up a lot of great points. Yeah,
and this is why I think teachers and administrators within a school, or within your office, in many companies I've worked for, they would have a person designated as kind of the and I forget what they call him, but the person who says, hey, if there's an incident, I'm the one who's going to, and they even have a flag at their cube. I'm the one who's going to direct people, because, Chris, you're not going to know, or you're not going to remember. There's somebody new maybe there, but there's somebody in the office who says, I know what to do in an emergency. They got a flag, and everybody just follows them. And that's not usually code driven, but that's a great way to enforce the codes or to make use of the codes. So you've got a code that helps you get out, but if you don't understand that there's 2 exits, but that person does, that's a great way to help leverage the code to get people to safety.
That's
So
a heck of an idea, actually. Some I
yeah,
didn't think, but you're absolutely right. It's nice to have that one person that
yeah,
you can count on to get
yeah,
everybody out. That's a great idea, actually.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
as you were talking earlier at the beginning of the podcast, there's so many codes, right? There's
yeah,
books full of codes, and I'm
yeah,
sure even like I talk to some of these electrical engineers, and they live with codes, right? They have these
yeah.
big code books, but you don't know them all. You don't memorize them all.
No, no.
So there's different codes that are different that apply to different structures, different
Yep.
maybe even fields. So what are some of the different types of codes and standards that apply to architecture?
Well, architects tend to be kind of the hub of a building, so they kind of make sure that everything comes together. Because as we design something, it involves structural, electrical, mechanical. Sometimes there's high voltage electrical or building electrical, and then there's also low voltage electrical. So all of the cable and
Mm-hmm.
telephone and so forth. But any of these devices that are electrical could catch fire, could cause a fire. So you have to and so all of this, we have to kind of bring everybody together. Usually the architect is the hub. So we have to be kind of aware of all of these different things. So you're right, there's mechanical codes. Um, there are codes that help you save energy, which are less about life safety. There are
Mm-hmm.
codes that are very much about fire. The NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, puts out a whole slew of codes that have to do with fire. And some of them have to do with chemicals. Imagine people who make fireworks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're manufacturing fireworks. Well, that's obviously something that could blow up easily. Okay, well, so can a grain elevator at a farm. So so there are codes that help say this is the best way to do that. We're not going to prevent you from making fireworks or storing grain, but here's a great way. Here's the best way to do that safely. So, and those codes are very specific to that particular building type or to that manufacturing process or whatever it is. Um, One interesting code that is not really a code is the ADA, the Americans
Mm-hmm.
with Disabilities Act. And I want to touch on that very briefly. A lot of code officials will enforce it as a code, but technically it's a law, which means you could really only enforce it unless somebody has adopted it as a code. You enforce it through litigation. So what's interesting about that is that in some cases, uh, you could say this is not a code. I don't have to abide by this. I do not have to design to ADA. The first time somebody in a wheelchair can't get to what they're trying to do, you get sued. Then you're in a legal battle in court.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a kind of a different, and that what it's trying to do is say we don't want to discriminate against people with disabilities, right? So there's all kinds of great cases that have nothing to do with building codes or life safety. Even there was a federal building in Washington D.C. where a person in a wheelchair sued because they had to go through the back door of the building to get in because that was the only handicap accessible entrance. And they said, why should I be treated differently? Another one was I think it was a convention center in Washington D.C. as well. I used to live up in that area, and the handicapped seats were right behind a big column blocking their view. And they said, so there's nothing, other than it feels like discrimination. And so they took it to court.
That's
So you have to think
interesting.
about these things. Yep,
I got a question for you then.
sure.
So, there's, newer buildings, maybe even some of the older buildings, you have to make sure you have like those ramps, right? Accessible for maybe someone in a wheelchair. So, but you also have these buildings that I guess are called grandfathered, right?
Yep.
Where, let's say it's a 2-story building, office complex, but it was built pre a certain date and there's only steps. So how do those get around the issue with ADA where like if I'm in a wheelchair, I come there, I'm like, well, I can't get to the second floor, but yet they're
Yeah.
not required to. I don't know if that's a question you can answer, or maybe you've seen it pop up.
I can answer it in concept. It gets a
Sure.
little, and I haven't kept up with that part of the codes. I haven't personally done a lot of renovation work in a long time, but the codes typically never require a building owner or an architect to go back and retroactively apply the code to any building.
Okay.
That's true of any building. So let's say we came out with a new code that addressed the issue of school shootings versus panic bars to get out,
Hmm.
right? Let's say a code came out and really addressed it well. They're not going to require all schools to suddenly go back and the code can't do that, right?
Right.
So with ADA, it's kind of the same thing. If I got an existing building and it doesn't meet that, if it doesn't meet ADA, you're not required to go back and do anything about it. That would be undue hardship on the owner.
Right.
Unless you go, if you're doing a renovation and the renovation meets a certain percentage, and I don't have that in front of me,
Hmm.
it's a certain percentage of the overall design of the overall size of the building, then you can be required to retroactively incorporate ADA into the design, especially with something like that, the front door. You'd have to do that.
Well, no,
So
thanks for explaining that and shedding some light on that. So, how often, and this is maybe too general of an answer or a question, but I'll ask it. How often are codes changed?
well, the IBC, okay, so behind every code, there is a body, a group of people who
Hmm.
govern that code, who assess it, who edit it. There's a whole group of people. One of the jobs I was on, one of the former code writers, actually, he was one of the fire protection specialists on this job I was on. So it was kind of fun to talk to him about how the codes get changed. The IBC, the International Building Code, releases a new version every 3 years,
Okay.
typically. I think NFPA does the same. I don't remember if they're in sync. But they do update regularly. And in some cases, the IBC will come out with addendum in between those 3 years. When something new has come up, something's come to light, there was an incident somewhere and they want to address it and they realize the code doesn't really address it, they'll come out with these addendum. So these people are constantly working and monitoring buildings and monitoring designs, monitoring events, things that are happening, and they're trying to update the codes to match, what's going on. And you have to be, it's a little tricky. You have to be a little careful because your local jurisdiction
Hmm.
may also write addendum to that code. They'll say, we adopt IBC a certain version, a certain year, and that's the one that you're required to design to, even if there's a newer code out. You
Oh,
design to the code that's been adopted. That's the one that's legally has been adopted for that jurisdiction. And then they may say, we adopt, 2019 or whatever, or 2017 or 2020, whatever it is. But we also have these like 5 addendum that have to do with something specific to our jurisdiction. Then if the IBC comes out with their own addendum, the local jurisdiction adopts or doesn't adopt those, and they vote to do that. So that's all of this is you just kind of you basically go to your local jurisdiction and say, what are the codes I got to meet? They'll give you a list. They'll tell you exactly what the status is. So
that's interesting too. So, codes, sometimes people think them as a hindrance because they get in the way.
yeah,
And they're there for a reason, but
yeah.
maybe that's not been. I mean, it's like, oh, do I really need that code there? So what I'm trying to get at is, have you seen or have you come across when you're designing maybe a building or whatever it might be, a structure, that where a code is kind of prevented you from doing a particular design? And if so, what do you do to get around
So you don't ever get around it. Let's be clear.
it?
I know what you're saying, but I just want to, I
Right.
know exactly. And yes, you do want to get around it. What you're really trying to do is protect the people inside the building, protect the structure, but find an alternate means of doing that protection. So in code speak, we call that an equivalency. And you'll say, I can provide equivalent protection in this area if you let me do this. And then you have
Okay.
to go prove it. Now, sometimes it might, let's say it has to do with a fire barrier and you got a duct going through the fire barrier and you want to do something, it's a different condition. So every fire barrier, every time you got a penetration through wall that's a fire barrier, you have to seal it up properly. And every one of those sealing procedures and the design of that has been carefully vetted
Hmm.
through the manufacturers. Actually, they have all of these sort of tested designs. So there's a lab that tests these and says, all right, we tested this particular design and it worked. Well, we got something here that's a little different. It's a strangely shaped duct. We had to do it this way. We have this condition. You don't have a design that meets that. So what you do is you either ask the manufacturer of the sealant, for example, can you give me a ruling that says, in our opinion, this meets the intent and this will work, or they have to go test it. Another way to go is to go to the authority having jurisdiction and you say, hey, I have an alternate means. Here's a special situation. Here's what's going on. People are reasonable and you have to take your arguments and look through it logically and meet with people and say, how are we going to solve this problem? If you go to the AHJ and say, I've got this problem, help me solve it, they will help you solve it 9 times out of 10.
That's
So,
pretty cool. So when anyone thinks of building anything, whether
yes.
it's a big structure, small structure, they always be like, oh man, I gotta get permits, right?
Yep.
So is there any kind of construction out there that you know of, or if it even exists, that you don't need to worry about getting permits?
Yeah, but that gets a little bit, the code does allow for that.
Oh, okay.
And I recently was looking through IBC on another matter, and somebody's going to call me out on this, but there are certain types, especially temporary structures,
Okay.
where you've got to build something that's going to last a certain amount of time so that you can build something else. So that's a case where you would not need a building permit. But I think there's rules about what that structure can be, what it's made of, and how long it can last. You can't keep it up indefinitely. So there's certain there's certain structures like that, but typically no, everything that you want to build, you're going to have to get a building permit, and you're going to have to get an occupancy permit as well. So people can't, as soon as the building's done, people can't just walk right in. The building inspector's got to come out, look at it, make sure it meets code, make sure the sprinkler's working. He's going to look at the commissioning reports to make sure everything's working properly before he allows you to open that building for business. So he
All
or
right.
she,
Well,
I should say. Yeah.
well, thanks for kind of clearing that for me. It's interesting. Before I started the podcast this morning, I was looking at the questions and I was like, building code or building safety codes. I'm like, all right, this is interesting, but I'm probably gonna get through all these questions and have all this time to spare. But I don't think I got through 25% of what I wanted to talk to you about. And here we are hitting the end of the day or the end of the podcast.
Yeah.
I'd love to invite you back, David. This is an interesting topic, and I know we kind of we had some fun with it, but it is, in all seriousness, I think everyone gets the idea of just how important codes and standards are. But I'd love to, have you come back on and talk more about this and some other, topics that you might want to share with the audience. So we'd love to have you back, David.
Well, I'd love to, and I'll recommend everybody just think of codes as caring for people. If you think of it that way, it changes your perspective. So that's why I think it's a good title. So thanks for having me on.